My name's Darren. I'm from Cornwall, and I don't know if this counts as a scary story in the traditional sense, but it scared me, so maybe it'll scare you too. So basically, a few years ago, I found out that an old schoolmate of mine had become the youngest ever person in the UK to be convicted of being a terrorist. The police raided his mum and dad's house back in 2019 and nicknamed him after they found instructions on how to make bombs. He went to court over it, but managed to dodge prison time because of how young he was when he downloaded the instructions. The local paper said that he was a neo-Nazi, and I'm not disputing that because apparently the old Bill found all sorts of Hitler stuff when they raided his bedroom. But when I looked into it myself, there was way more to it than that. When I first heard about it, I read every single article about it that I could get my hands on. I used to be dead pally with the guy back in year 7 and year 8 and seemed like an alright kid back then. But then apparently after I moved schools at the start of year 9, he took a drastic turn for the worse. The whole thing hit really close to home, so you can imagine I wanted to know as much about it as I possibly could, mainly because I wanted to know what had gone so wrong in the guy's life that he thought about making bombs. And that's how I discovered, while reading one online article, that my old pal had been visiting the website of a group known as O9A. And the article kind of glossed over any details on the group and stated that they were neo-Nazis and just moved on. But like I said, there was a lot more to it than that. Having read a lot about various UK neo-Nazi groups while researching my old pal's arrest, the name O9A jumped out at me immediately because I've never heard of it before. I read all about the National Front, National Action, and the likes of Combat 18, but never anything about a group called O9A. So out of sheer curiosity, I decided to do some research on them to see what my old pal had gotten himself into. Then from the moment I plugged the name into Google, I think my jaw stayed on the floor for the whole time. O9A stands for the Order of the Nine Angles, and that's angles, not angels. And to put it in the simplest terms possible, they're Nazi Satanists. They want to tear down society which they think is controlled by Jews and build a new one based on paganism and a sort of survival of the fittest mentality. One of their big beliefs is human sacrifice, which they think will speed up the downfall of civilization. But they're not all talk when it comes to actually inflicting suffering and things like that, as I found out for myself when I looked them up. In the summer of 1997, 2 Swedish members of the O9A committed the Keelers Park murder, which was where those 2 blokes tried to ritually sacrifice an Algerian man. Then in 2019, an American soldier was found out to be a member of the Order of the Nine Angles and was planning on kidnapping and killing his fellow soldiers in the name of Satan. I know you're probably thinking, okay, I was with you till you tried making out that there's satanic terrorists in the US Army, but please, if you think I'm trying to mess with you, then look it up. The fella's name is Ethan Melzer, and there's a bloody New York Times article about the whole thing. And this is legit, not just some stupid creepypasta. The year after that, another soldier was found to be a member of O9A, only this was a member of a group within the O9A called, and you might want to spell this out instead of saying it so you don't get in trouble, the RAPE Waffen. The group of scumbags hatched the idea of violating white girls and getting them pregnant from it so that more white babies would be born. Like I said, my jaw is resting firmly on the floor by this point as I was reading stuff like that, and because it legitimately sounds like badly written blue hair fan fiction, I had to stop and look all this up as I was reading it, only to find out that, yeah, it was all true. Another one that sounded too insane to be true was the story about another member of the Order of Nine Angles, whose name I've got handy, but I don't know that you want to edit it out, but he's named Luke Austin Lane. He and his 2 mates were caught planning the murder of some Antifa couple. And yeah, I'm no fan of Antifa, but this bloke was actually planning on killing this couple's kids in front of them before finishing them off in turn. They're kids, man. What kind of scumbag deliberately executes innocent kids like that? And I just couldn't believe what I was reading, but it kept going. To prepare for the murders, Luke Lane and his mates killed a sheep, drank its blood, and then took a lot of LSD or mushrooms or something to go on a sort of spiritual journey. I read another thing about a bloke in Canada who killed a Muslim guy, and then I think he stabbed some Sikh fella, and then when he was caught, boom, police found out that he was a member of O9A. And there are loads more satanic murders like that, mainly in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, and they're all connected to what is literally a satanic terrorist group. But to be honest, that's not even half of it, because if you look up all the stuff that the Order's members are involved in, you start seeing this same sick pattern playing out over and over again. Excluding 2018, every single year for the past 7 years, a member of the Order of the Nine Angles had been arrested and convicted of being a child abuser, be that through having material on their hard drives or actually doing disgusting things themselves. Most of these incidents have been in the UK, but as of 2021, they've spread to America and Sweden too. But then, as much as you might think that these dudes are just straight up creeps, and hear me out about this one, I don't think that's necessarily the case. The Order of the Nine Angles has these 2 documents about human sacrifices. One's called A Gift for the Prince, and the other is called Calling, A Guide to Sacrifice. Most of their literature is absolute garbage. Like, it's legitimately difficult because of how much jargon and inside language they use, but there's one bit that really stood out to me. Something that makes me think that all the CSEM stuff is basically part of their ethos. The Order says that human sacrifice isn't just confined to killing people. If they were burning and decapitating people every week, they'd all be caught in no time, right? Well, to continually propagate human suffering without overly alerting the authorities, the Order distributes CSEM as a way of sort of feeding evil, if that makes sense. It sounded wild to me at first, too. I can promise you, but the more I read and the more I thought about it, the more it all started to make this sort of horrible kind of sense to me. The kids involved in this, it's them that are being sacrificed, and by distributing the images of them being abused, the Order of the Nine Angles is able to sacrifice them over and over again while corrupting other people in the process. Again, I know this sounds too insane to be true, but here's yet another example of it happening back in 2020. In April of that year, Russian police raided the homes of a group suspected of, and this is a direct quote from the Russian website Now, incitement to murder due to religious and racial hatred, and criminal activities against women. I think they thought that these dudes were just neo-Nazis, but during the raids, they found the men were members of a Russian-based chapter of the O9A called Legion Av Satan. Turns out one of these lads had burned down a really old church someplace, and it was never solved until they found photos of him setting it on fire in his house. But that wasn't the worst part of it. As I was reading about this group, I remember thinking, okay, well, at least these lads weren't pedos, but then lower down the article from the Russian website, I saw that they were. They had been grooming kids in this place, Krasnodar, where they lived, and were trying to get them into underage prostitution. And I imagined that they were going to profit in some way from it. But that's not the point with these Order of the Nine Angles people. It's about suffering. It's about the suffering of innocent people. And that's what they trade in. It's because human suffering makes Satan more powerful, so they say. It has to be a specific kind of human suffering, though. The kind that doesn't improve a person. Things like grief, severe physical pain, or the lifelong mental scarring that comes with being abused at a really young age. And I'm sure you'll agree, the Order of the Nine Angles rabbit hole makes for some of the worst stuff you've ever heard, and by the time I'd finished reading about it, I was in 2 minds about my old mate not getting any jail time. He was 14 when he got into that order, 16 when he was arrested, so yeah, I can put that down to something a stupid teenage boy would do. But the Order is no joke, and the fact that he had some of their human sacrifice documents downloaded on his computer was very worrying. I'm not saying that we should lock everyone up who does or says something silly on the internet, but reading through all the O9A stuff makes me wonder if a mistake hasn't been made. And I hope my old mate turns a new leaf, and it was all just a silly phase to him. I mean, he's definitely sorry that he got caught because I know for a fact that he's got all kinds of restrictions placed on him. And don't ask me how I know. Everyone knows everyone in Cornwall, but I know he can't go on certain websites or talk to certain people, and if he does, he's in serious trouble. That'd definitely have me thinking I've made a mistake here, and I really do hope that he sees it that way, because honestly, the alternative is bloody well terrifying, isn't it? If he cracks on with life and it becomes something daft that he did back when he was a lad, then good on him. But if not, well, I imagine I'll be reading about him at some point in the future, for whatever terrible thing that he does, in the name of the devil. When I was 10, my life changed in ways I could never have imagined. My father inherited an old house in remote New South Wales from a distant relative we barely knew. He thought it would be an idyllic place to raise a family, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Little did he know what awaited us. The house was nestled in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense bushland. It was the perfect picture of tranquility, at least during the day. The house itself had an eerie, antiquated charm, with creaking floorboards and dimly lit hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. My family consisted of my father, my mother, my older sister Lucy, and me. We moved in with excitement and a sense of adventure, unaware of the horrors that would soon unfold. The first few nights were pretty uneventful. My father busied himself with repairs, my mother unpacked, and Lucy and I explored the property. On the fourth night, I had my first encounter. I was in my room, reading a book, when I felt a sudden chill. The room seemed darker than usual, and I had the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I looked up, and there, peering around the corner of the door frame, was a figure. It was barely visible, like a shadow, but I could make out the shape of a head and shoulders. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and the figure remained there for a few agonizing moments before disappearing. I convinced myself that it was just my imagination, despite the creeping fear that settled in my bones. Weeks passed and odd things continued to happen, mostly to me. My toys would be moved around and my bed would occasionally shake in the middle of the night. I told my parents, but they dismissed it as nightmares or childish imagination. One night I woke up to a whispering voice hissing my name. I sat up, drenched in sweat, and saw the same figure from before, now at the foot of my bed. It was closer and clearer. It had no features, just an inky blackness. I screamed and my mother rushed in, and the figure vanished the moment she opened the door, leaving her to comfort me and dismiss it as a bad dream. It wasn't until Lucy had her own experience that my parents began to take things seriously. She came to me one morning, pale and shaken, saying that she'd seen a woman in old-fashioned clothes standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her with hollow eyes. My parents started to believe something was off, but didn't want to admit that something supernatural might be happening. Our situation escalated over the 5 years that we lived there. It started out small, lights flickering, strange noises, and cold drafts, but grew increasingly malicious. 2 experiences stand out vividly in my memory from what I recall. The first happened during our 2nd year. My father had gone into town, leaving the rest of us alone, and it was a stormy night and the house seemed alive with almost its own energy. Lucy and I were in the living room trying to watch TV despite the frequent power flickers, and suddenly, the room went ice cold and the TV turned off entirely. In the next moment, the corner of the room darkened and we both saw it. An unmistakable figure peering out from the shadows, its eyes reflecting the dim light. It slowly moved closer and we could make out the shape of its mouth, twisted into a very cruel smile. Lucy grabbed my hand and we bolted upstairs to my parents' room, locking the door behind us. My mother tried to calm us down, but she too felt the coldness and unease that permeated the house. Another terrifying event occurred in our 4th year. My father had become more open to the idea that something was clearly wrong. He brought in a local priest to bless the house after numerous pleas from my mother, and that night, after the blessing, I was in the kitchen getting a drink of water when I felt a presence behind me. I turned and saw the same figure that had haunted me for years, now clearer than ever. It was a man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, with one side of his face hideously scarred. He stood at the entrance of the kitchen, blocking my exit, and I was paralyzed with fear. He began to move towards me, slowly, deliberately, and every step he took seemed to drain the warmth from the room. I fell to the floor, unable to move, only managing to scream when he was inches away. My father burst in, and the figure vanished, leaving the air thick with dread. The priest's blessing had stirred whatever malevolence resided there. In our final year, things became unbearable. The entire family started hearing voices, footsteps, and seeing the figure, now bolder and more frequent in its appearances. It seemed to thrive on our fear, growing stronger and more aggressive. Doors would slam, objects would fly across the room, and we all felt watched all the time, and we decided enough was enough. One evening, as we packed our things to leave, the activity reached a fever pitch. The house shook, the temperature dropped to freezing, and all of us saw shadows darting around. It seemed the entity didn't want us to go, but we were very resolute in our decision. We moved out the next day, leaving behind that cursed house and never looking back. Later on, we learned that the house had a very dark history. The man who built it in the 1800s was rumored to have gone mad and taken the lives of his family. His spirit, along with others, was said to haunt the property, reliving their final moments in a twisted loop of torment. Living in that house changed us all. We never spoke of it much after we left, but the memories lingered. And even now, years later, sometimes I wake up in the dead of night, half expecting to see a face peering around the corner, watching and waiting. My name's Ali. I'm 23 and I'm from East Lothian here in Scotland. I've been a fan of the channel for a while now, so I know this probably doesn't qualify as your typical scary story, but it's something that's been bothering me for a long time, and if it scares me, then I'm pretty sure it'll scare your viewers too. 3.5 years ago, a lad that I went to school with murdered his grandparents. It happened on Boxing Day of 2021, and it was all over the news the next morning that this lovely old couple had been found stabbed to death in their own home. Police said that they'd arrested the person that had done it, but for the first few days, they didn't release any details on who they were. Then, once they were sure that they were going to charge the person with murder, the police announced who it was: their own grandson. As you can probably imagine, everyone was absolutely gobsmacked when they found out, but what we wanted to know was why. Why kill your own grandparents in such a horrible way on the day after Christmas, too? We had to wait ages for the hearing and all, but there were loads of rumors flying around about why he'd killed them. I think most people thought that it was like a mental illness thing. So when the hearing kicked off and the lad's lawyers told the court that he heard voices telling him to kill his nan and granddad, there was this collective thing of, told you so. I understand why people would choose to believe that too. I mean, why else would someone kill two people that love and care for them? This lad was living with them at the time, and they were looking after him too, properly, and they weren't abusive or anything. So he had to be mental to do something so horrible, right? But no one knew him thought that, though. At least no one I knew anyway, because, in actual fact, the guy had always been like that. At school, everyone called him James, or Jay for short, and even back then he was a proper weirdo. And I don't mean a little bit of a weirdo, like lovably weird. I mean he was a complete arsehole. He was a bit of a goth, loved his rock music, obsessed over horror films, but none of the other goths in our school would hang around with him because he was a total dick. I'm sure the school had a name for whatever condition he had. antisocial behavior disorder or something, but to us, he was just an arsehole. Some of my mates grew up with dyslexia, autism, ADHD, you name it. But they were sound guys, that lovable kind of weird. Whereas Jay was just an arrogant prick with a bad case of main character syndrome. The last I heard of Jay, he changed his name from James to Vincent. And people wondered why for a bit until someone worked out that it was because he was obsessed with some vampire film that had a character with that name. And that was Jay in a nutshell, really. He thought he was better than he really was, when, really, he was just a sad act. We thought that's all he was, too. A total dickhead, but a fairly harmless one. And then he went and murdered his own bloody grandparents and proved us all wrong. I actually did start to believe that Jay had gone just mental because we started hearing all this stuff about how he was hearing voices and that he didn't really remember killing his nana and granddad and just sort of came to after it happened. You see, he actually handed himself into the police after he'd done it, went right down to the police station and told them everything. So to me, it sort of did seem like he'd had a mad psychotic episode then felt terrible afterwards. But then we all heard something about how the thing that caused Jay to snap was an argument over a Christmas hamper. Someone had sent Jay's grandparents a load of wine and cheese or whatever, or maybe a few of those miniature whiskey samplers. Either way, there was alcohol involved, and Jay decided that he wanted it all for himself. He very selfishly F's off to his bedroom with the booze, and then up the stairs comes Granddad to tell him to give it back. An argument ensued, nasty words were exchanged, but then Jay's solution was to grab a kitchen knife and stab both of his grandparents so deep that there were knife marks on their bones. Jay's lawyers obviously managed to weave in the whole story about him being a schizophrenic, and I read that some doctor agreed that he wasn't fit to stand trial. He never went to prison. He's in some mental institution now, but I think that's exactly what he wanted. I don't give a monkey's toss what some doctor has to say about it, because anyone who knew him knows that Jay has always been like that. If he didn't get his way, he threw a fit, which is basically why he had no friends in school. I also think Jay's behavioral problems are why he ended up living with his grandparents in the first place. He turned 18, his parents told him to get his act together or get out of their house, and the grandparents stepped in to take care of him. All that considered, I think it makes what he did to them extra terrible. They gave him a chance, and he returned the favor by stabbing them both to death on freaking Boxing Day of all days. I don't think he's sorry either. I mean, I think he regrets killing them because he has to face the consequences of his actions, but that's all he's sorry for. First thing he did after killing his grandparents was to think, how can I spin this to make me look as good as possible, which was exactly the same kind of thing he did in school. Not long ago, me and a few pals went to a local boozer for a few pints on Boxing Day, and I ended up bumping into one of the goths that I used to hang around with in school. We swapped a wee bit of small talk at first, you know, the sort of how you been, what you been up to. But then after we gotten a few drinks in us, the subject of Weirdo Jay came up, and he ended up telling me what happened to make his little friend group exclude him, and by the time he'd finished, I was practically picking my jaw up off the floor. They'd been hanging around with Jay just after school kicked out, walking through the school car park to where the bus stop for school pickups used to be. He said Jay picked up a rock, then just hurled it through the car window of a teacher he'd clashed with that day. They were all like, "What the bloody hell do you think you're doing, you rage?" And then everyone legs it, but then the next day, they all get dragged up to the head teacher's office where there's a police officer waiting for them. The whole thing had been partially caught on camera, so the teachers knew roughly who it was. They just needed to figure out exactly who did it and why. The goth lads, once they were told it had been caught on camera, owned up to the fact that they'd been there when the window was smashed, but they also told the truth when they said that it was Jay's fault and that he'd done it out of the blue. One second, they're just walking along having a bit of crack, and the next, Jay's lashing a stone through the car's window. All four goth lads said the same thing, but then when it came time to question Jay about it, he gave an excuse that sounds frighteningly familiar. He told the head and the Bobby who was with him that it was the 4 goth lads that had bullied him into doing it. According to Jay, the lads that he was with had threatened him with a good old-fashioned kicking if he didn't smash the window, so to save himself a hiding, he did as they told him. And that was Jay all over. Nothing was ever his fault. There was always someone else to blame. Every situation he entered himself into was unfair, and folks conspired against him no matter where he went or what he did. But then, I'm sure you're asking by now, why didn't Jay get expelled for smashing a teacher's car window? Well, word was that he put on such a good show that the teachers didn't know who to believe. So rather than go ahead and press charges against him or exclude him from school, Jay ended up with a week's suspension, and then he was allowed to come back. But then the other goth lads got the same punishment too. He obviously stopped hanging around with those goth boys, but it wasn't because they were bullying him. It was because he couldn't manipulate and control them. To me, I see exact parallels between what happened with that car window and what happened with his grandparents. He learned from a very early age that it's possible to manipulate the system, even though you've done something wrong. The lad that I bumped into at the pub said that, after the whole window smashing incident, Jay had personally told him that he was untouchable. He used that exact word too, untouchable. They never hung around with him again after that, having secured the title of the most arrogant prick they'd ever had the displeasure of coming across. But Jay didn't just stay some arrogant gobshite. He got worse and worse, until in the end, when he learned that he couldn't manipulate his grandparents anymore, he just killed them. If he'd just gone to prison for 30, 40 years, it wouldn't bother me so much, and I 100% wouldn't be writing this. But an absolute psychopath of the cringiest order has managed to game the system and basically get away with murder. Instead of living the rest of his life in a vulnerable prisoners unit, because blokes are rightfully kicking the crap out of him for killing 2 lovely old dears who wanted nothing more than to look after their wayward grandson, Jay is living out the rest of his life in relative comfort, having completely cheated the system and won. And that scares me more than any ghost story ever could.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
A warning. I had just arrived in France for my trip, and since I had already booked an apartment through Airbnb, I booked a cab for my destination. I'm a flexible traveler, so I often booked a budget-friendly shared apartment, which always worked out in my favor. I did the same back then, but little did I know what kind of horror this trip had in store for me. Is this your first time in France? I raised my head from the phone screen and met with the 2 hazel brown eyes looking back at me through the front mirror. I observed the man, who seemed to be in his 30s, for a few seconds before replying, "No, I've been here once before." I returned my focus to the screen after saying that. "Be careful in this neighborhood, though. Plenty of sketchy things are happening here lately," he said as he turned around to the place where the apartment was. I nodded, not wanting to pay him much attention, thinking he was babbling around and waiting for him to stop the car. He probably understood that I was ignorant of his warning, so he said nothing after that and quietly dropped me off at the apartment building. He looked weirdly at me before taking his money and driving off, but I just shrugged. When I got inside the apartment, I found a middle-aged couple waiting for me there. They were the people I was sharing that apartment with. They greeted me warmly and told me they were here for their anniversary vacation before heading to their rooms, and I went to mine with my luggage. I planned on catching up on some sleep before heading out for a tour the following day, so I locked my room from the inside and headed straight to the shower. I didn't realize the apartment's wall was so thin until I heard faint moans from the room beside me. But it was okay, since I would only use this place to sleep. Besides, this place was cheaper than others, so who was I to complain about the soundproofing? It took me about 10 minutes to finish the shower and exit the bathroom. I grabbed my bathrobe from my suitcase and wrapped it around my body before bed. Some muffled whispering awakened me, and I checked my cell phone for the time. It was around 2 o'clock. Frustrated and thirsty, I got up to drink some water, only to realize I hadn't brought any water bottles into my room before sleeping. I never had any problem with thin walls, but now that I realized that even whispers could be heard there, it was pretty bothersome because I was hesitant to go to the kitchen and grab some water. But it wasn't like I didn't pay my money, so I unlocked my room and headed to the kitchen. The whispering stopped from the sound of the refrigerator's door. The moment I entered my room, the whispering continued. I didn't think I wouldn't use it, but I was glad I had brought my earplugs. So I took them out of my bag and stuffed them in my ears before returning to my peaceful slumber. They were so damn good that they canceled out the noises right away. I was startled awake when someone shook me, only to find 2 police officers standing in my room. Bewildered, I scanned the room for a few seconds and realized my room's door was broken. "What happened, officers?" I asked them in confusion. "We had been knocking on your door for more than an hour. How could you not hear us?" the lady officer asked in anger. "I'm sorry, it was too noisy last night, so I put my earplugs in. That's the reason I couldn't hear you." I showed it to them after saying that. "What noises did you say you heard?" the female officer asked again, while the other officer tried checking the earplugs by putting them on. It was whispering noises. Probably the couple staying in the next room were talking. "What exactly is the issue here, officers?" I asked again in confusion when I noticed more officers outside my room. "He's right, these do block all sound." The male officer sounded impressed as he said that, only to receive a death glare from his fellow officer. "We're here because the couple you just told us about had been murdered. There was a complaint from the apartment next door that they heard screams, which was why we were surprised you didn't hear it." The female officer snatched the earplugs from her colleague as she said in a suspicious tone. I was too shocked by the news to realize I was being suspected of a crime I had no idea about. I followed their lead to the crime scene and shuddered with horror at the sight of the couple who warmly welcomed me lying dead as the people from forensics were examining the scene. They asked me questions, including if I knew them from anywhere before, and I answered them truthfully. But since I was the only one present at the apartment when the murder happened, and there were no signs of a break-in, they still suspected me. When the female officer told me I still needed to accompany them to the police station for questioning, I realized I was a suspect. I told them I had nothing to do with them, for I was a traveler and was here for a trip. Looking at how the situation wasn't in my favor, they didn't listen to my words. Just when they handcuffed me and we stepped outside the apartment, one of the medical examiners called, "Hey, Carla, look at this." The lady officer turned around to see why he called her, only to find a piece of paper in his hand. "What is it?" she asked. "It was sticking outside the door. I don't know how we couldn't see it." He handed the paper to her as he said that and returned to his work. As she read it, her expression grew confused and she looked at me. "Do you know anything about this?" I looked at her in confusion as she showed me the paper. I leaned a bit to try and take a good look, and a chill ran down my spine as I read its content. "I told you to stay careful, didn't I?" the note said. The words echoed in my mind as I stood there, petrified. My eyes widened with fear and shock. The officers realized I knew something and started asking me what it was. I stammered on my words as I said, He told me to be careful." My eyes still fixated on the note in her hands. Her confusion heightened at my response. "Who?" she asked. With fear apparent in my eyes, I looked at her. "The cab driver." My voice shook uncontrollably as I replied. The officers seemed convinced I might have nothing to do with the murder, but a mysterious piece of paper was not enough proof that I was innocent, so they still took me to the police station and interrogated me for 2 hours. When they realized there was nothing they could use against me, besides the fact that I was in the apartment at the time of the murder, they let me go. They were probably going to find the driver and question him after what I told them, but it did not put me at ease, for I could not understand why he would do something like that, only because I ignored his warning.
I live in a place called Crowley, Louisiana, not too far from the city of Lafayette. It's a pretty boring town, not much really happens here at all. Perhaps the most interesting thing that goes on is the yearly International Rice Festival, which should basically tell you all you need to know about the place. On April 2nd of this year, I was sitting out on the porch of my parents' house at about 9 in the evening, just chilling and scrolling through Twitter. It was a quiet night. The sun had just set, and aside from a little low-volume music playing out of a neighbor's window, it was a peaceful, serene Louisiana night. But then I began to hear something in the near distance, a sound that was weirdly familiar to me. It was this blaring noise that got louder and louder the more I listened, until eventually it was so loud that people were coming out of their houses to check out what it was. It was a siren, this start-stop wailing siren sound that echoed all throughout our neighborhood. And although I couldn't quite work out where I'd heard it before, it was honestly one of the most ominous sounds I'd ever heard in my life. I was panicking over what it was about, so I called my dad onto the front porch to see if he knew what it was about. He didn't seem to take me all that seriously at first, and I'm pretty sure he was just as confused as why I found the sound of police sirens so alarming. But when he heard the sound, and recognized that it wasn't no regular police siren, he got this serious expression on his face and told me to get back in the house and go up to my room. I was already pretty freaked out, but when my phone starts buzzing with notifications from my friends, all asking if I could hear the siren sound in the streets, it was all over Crowley. That same horrible sound was blaring out all over our town, and none of my friends seemed to know why. Their parents were freaking out too. Some of them were asking if it was a bomb siren or something, and actually told them to go down into the basements just in case something horrible was about to happen. I heard my dad walking in the hallway upstairs, and I peeked out to ask him if he had any idea what was going on, and he had actually taken his gun out of the locker he kept it in. Now that really did freak me out. Seeing him panicking too was just the worst. Then I get a group text from a friend of a friend who texted a bunch of us letting us know that the siren that we were hearing was actually from that Purge movie. That's where I heard it before. There were some of us who actually really flipped at this point and said they knew the Purge was actually going to happen one day, and tonight was the night it was going to happen. A few minutes after they started, the sirens died down, and although my dad kept watch downstairs with his gun, nothing terrible happened, thank God. Then the next day it was all over the local news that it was actually a siren that the cops had played from their bullhorn things to let everyone know that there was going to be a curfew in place. People were going crazy, asking why the cops had chosen to play a noise from a scary movie instead of just telling us that there were going to be a curfew in place. Apparently they tried to let people know that there was going to be a curfew, but I sure didn't hear anything about it. But then they used the sound from that Purge movie. I mean, what were these idiots thinking? The chief of police ended up releasing a statement a few days later saying he had no idea that the sound was from a horror movie and made a full and frank apology to the people of Crowley. But, I mean, I felt kind of dumb having freaked out so much over nothing, but seriously, for a few minutes, the whole thing was absolutely terrifying.